was Christmas Eve in 2020, and I had just finished wrapping the last of the presents for my family. I was living in a small house in Portland, Oregon, and with the pandemic in full swing, our family had decided to keep the celebration simple and virtual. My plan was to drop off the presents at my parents' house the next morning, wave through the window, and then head back home for a quiet Christmas. I'd been spending the evening watching holiday movies and sipping hot cocoa. The living room was warm and cozy, with a small Christmas tree glowing in the corner and the faint scent of pine filling the air. Around 10 p.m., I decided to call it a night. I turned off the TV, tidied up the room, and went to brush my teeth. As I was getting ready for bed, the doorbell rang. It startled me. I wasn't expecting anyone, especially not this late. My house was in a quiet neighborhood, and the streets were typically empty after dark. I hesitated, wondering if I should answer it. Maybe it was a neighbor, or perhaps someone had the wrong address. I walked to the door, peering through the peephole. A delivery driver stood on the porch, wearing a hooded jacket and holding a large box. His face was partially shadowed, but I could see enough to notice that he wasn't wearing any identifiable uniform or badge. That struck me as odd. Most delivery services made a point of branding their uniforms. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice cautious. "Delivery for Sarah Jenkins," the man replied, his voice low and unsteady. My heart sank. Sarah Jenkins wasn't my name, and I didn't know anyone by that name in the area. "You've got the wrong house," I said firmly, not opening the door. There was a long pause before the man spoke again. "Are you sure? This is the address on the box." I didn't like the way he said it. His tone wasn't confused. It was insistent, almost accusatory. "I'm sure," I said, my voice growing sharper. "Please leave." I watched through the peephole as the man stood there for a moment, seemingly undecided. Finally, he placed the box on the porch and walked away. I waited until I couldn't see him anymore before opening the door to take a closer look at the package. The box was plain and unmarked, with no shipping labels or addresses on it. That was the first red flag. The second was its weight. It felt much lighter than I'd expected for its size. I brought it inside, my curiosity outweighing my unease, and placed it on the dining table. Grabbing a pair of scissors, I carefully opened the box. Inside was a single item, a small, broken doll with its head twisted at an unnatural angle. My stomach turned as I stared at it. Who would send something like this? And why? Before I could process what I was seeing, my phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. "Do you like your present?" Panic set in as I realized this wasn't a random delivery. It was targeted. Someone knew I was home alone. I quickly locked all the doors and windows, my hands trembling as I tried to think of what to do. I called my brother, Jason, who lived about 15 minutes away. He picked up on the second ring. "Jason, someone just sent me something really creepy," I blurted out, my voice shaking. "I think someone's watching the house." "Stay where you are," he said immediately. "I'm coming over right now." While I waited for Jason, I grabbed a kitchen knife and sat on the couch, my eyes darting to every shadow and corner of the room. Minutes felt like hours. Then, just as I was starting to feel a little calmer, I heard something. It was faint but unmistakable. The sound of footsteps on the gravel driveway. My breath caught as I peered through the curtains. The man from earlier was standing at the edge of the yard, staring directly at the house. He wasn't holding a box this time. Instead, his hands hung loosely at his sides, as if he were waiting for something. The porch light illuminated his face just enough for me to see a cold, unsettling smile. I called Jason again, whispering into the phone as I described what was happening. He told me he was only a few minutes away and to stay hidden. I watched as the man took a step closer to the house, his smile widening. My heart was racing as I debated whether to confront him or stay put. Just then, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the tension. Jason's headlights lit up the yard, and the man immediately turned and ran into the darkness. Jason jumped out of his car, flashlight in hand, and shouted after the man, but he was already gone. Together we searched the yard and the surrounding area, but there was no sign of him. The only evidence he'd been there were his footprints in the snow, leading from the driveway to the porch and back into the woods. Jason stayed with me that night, and the next morning we reported the incident to the police. They took the box and the doll as evidence, but didn't seem optimistic about finding the man. "It's probably just some sick prank," one of the officers said. But that didn't make me feel any better. I spent Christmas Day with Jason and his family, grateful to be surrounded by people I trusted. But even now, I can't shake the memory of that man's smile or the feeling of being watched. Whoever he was, he knew where I lived, and the thought of that still keeps me awake at night. This was the first year I'd be spending Christmas alone. It might sound sad, but it wasn't really a big deal to me. I couldn't afford the flight back to my hometown in Madison, Wisconsin, and my job as a tech consultant had me working right up until Christmas Eve. I'd promised my parents and siblings we'd catch up over a video call, so I tried to make the best of it. I had plans for a cozy day. My apartment in Denver was small but comfortable, with a big bay window overlooking the snowy street. On Christmas morning, I woke up early and turned on the classic Grinch movie while I made myself a big breakfast of pancakes, bacon, and coffee. The smell of maple syrup filled the apartment, and for a while, I forgot about being alone. By noon, I was on FaceTime with my family, laughing as my nephews excitedly showed me their new toys. After the call, I had no real plans for the rest of the day. I wandered over to the window with my mug of coffee, watching the occasional car drive by, and admiring the Christmas lights on the neighboring houses. Then, I decided to step outside to grab my mail. When I opened the door, I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the snow on my porch, not fresh ones, but frozen over, as if they had been made hours earlier during the night when the temperature had dropped below freezing. The realization sent a slight chill down my spine. Who would have been outside my door in the middle of the night? I glanced around the street, but it was empty except for a couple of parked cars. Shrugging it off, I grabbed my mail and went back inside, locking the door behind me. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe a delivery driver or someone cutting through the neighborhood. Still, the image of those frozen footprints stuck in my mind. To distract myself, I decided to watch some Hallmark-style Christmas movies. I opened the presents and letters my family had mailed me earlier in the week, and even indulged in some Christmas chocolates. By mid-afternoon, I was starting to feel restless. It had stopped snowing, and the sun was peeking through the clouds, so I figured it would be a good time for a walk around the neighborhood. I bundled up in my thick coat, scarf, and gloves before stepping outside. The air was crisp, and the sound of my boots crunching in the snow was oddly soothing. I wandered along the sidewalks, admiring the elaborate light displays and enjoying the stillness of the day. For a while, it felt peaceful. That was until I noticed someone else walking on the opposite side of the street. They were bundled up in a heavy coat and scarf, their hat pulled low over their face. I didn't think much of it at first, just another person out for a walk. But a few minutes later, I spotted them again. This time, they were ahead of me, walking in the same direction. I stopped in my tracks, confused. How had they gotten ahead of me so quickly? It was like they had doubled back or taken a shortcut. Trying to shake off the unease creeping in, I turned at the next corner and headed back toward my apartment. As soon as I stepped through my front door and kicked off my boots, there was a loud knock. My heart jumped. I had just come inside, and there was no way anyone could have gotten to my door that quickly unless they had been following me. I froze, my hand hovering over the doorknob. After a moment, I peered through the peephole and saw a man standing on my porch. He wore a baseball cap pulled low over his face, but something about him felt familiar. My chest tightened as I realized it was the same person I had seen walking earlier. "What do you want?" I called out through the door, trying to sound confident. The man didn't respond. Instead, he knocked again, harder this time. I could feel my pulse quicken as I stepped back, watching him through the peephole. He didn't move, just stood there with his head slightly tilted downward. "Go away! I'm calling the police!" I shouted. Still, he didn't speak. Instead, he suddenly lunged at the door, shaking the handle and throwing his weight against it. The entire door rattled violently, and I stumbled backward in fear. For what felt like an eternity, he kept slamming into the door, the hinges groaning under the force. Just as I grabbed my phone to dial 911, the noise stopped. Silence filled the apartment, and I cautiously approached the peephole again. To my shock, I saw 2 police officers outside, pinning the man to the ground. Blue and red lights from their patrol car flashed across my living room walls. I opened the door, my voice trembling as I tried to explain what had just happened. The officers told me they had been called by a neighbor, who reported seeing the man pacing back and forth in front of my apartment for hours. What they found in his car made my stomach turn: a roll of duct tape, 2 knives, and a firearm. When the officers asked if I knew him, the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. He was an ex-boyfriend I hadn't spoken to in over 6 years. He lived in another state, and we hadn't kept in touch since our breakup. The thought that he had driven all this way to show up uninvited, on Christmas Day no less, made my skin crawl. The police told me he refused to say why he was there, but it wasn't hard to guess his intentions. That night, I slept with every light in the apartment on. The image of his face at my door burned into my memory. Christmas would never feel the same again. It was Christmas Eve of 2021, and I was house-sitting for my boss, Mr. Tanner, in a quiet neighborhood in Boulder, Colorado. He and his wife had left town to visit family for the holidays, and they'd asked me to keep an eye on their house and take care of their golden retriever, Bailey. The Tanner's home was spacious and beautifully decorated, with twinkling lights on the porch, a large Christmas tree in the living room, and a cozy fireplace. I didn't mind spending the evening there. My own apartment was small and didn't feel very festive, so this was a nice change. After feeding Bailey and turning on the fireplace, I curled up on the couch with a blanket and a cup of hot chocolate. The plan was to watch some Christmas movies and relax. Around 8:30 p.m., as I was halfway through Home Alone, I heard the faint sound of a doorbell. It startled me because I wasn't expecting anyone, and the Tanners hadn't mentioned any visitors. Bailey barked once and trotted toward the front door, his tail wagging. I hesitated before getting up, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe it was a delivery driver, though it seemed late for that. When I opened the door, no one was there. The front porch was empty, and the street outside was silent, with no cars or pedestrians in sight. A light snow had begun to fall, and the glow from the porch lights reflected off the flakes, creating an almost serene atmosphere. I stepped outside, calling out, "Hello, is anyone there?" My voice echoed faintly in the stillness, but there was no response. Feeling a little uneasy, I went back inside and locked the door, making sure the deadbolt was secure. An hour later, as I was starting to feel more at ease, the doorbell rang again. This time, Bailey barked more insistently, his hackles rising as he stood by the door. My stomach tightened. I peeked through the peephole but saw nothing except the empty porch and the faint glow of the streetlights beyond. I decided to ignore it, telling myself it was probably some kids playing a prank. But just as I turned to walk away, a loud knock echoed through the house, followed by another. My heart raced as I stared at the door, unsure what to do. Gathering my courage, I shouted, "Whoever you are, go away! This isn't funny!" The knocking stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was almost more unsettling. I grabbed my phone and called my friend Elena, who lived nearby. She answered on the second ring, and I quickly explained what was happening. "Do you want me to come over?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. Before I could answer, I heard a noise from the backyard. It was faint but distinct, like the creak of a gate swinging open. My blood ran cold as I realized the Tanner's backyard gate wasn't locked. It had never occurred to me to check it earlier. "Elena, I think someone's in the backyard," I whispered, my voice shaking. She told me to call the police immediately and promised to stay on the line with me. I crept to the kitchen, which had a clear view of the backyard through the sliding glass door. The porch light illuminated part of the yard, but beyond that, the shadows of the tall wooden fence loomed. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, but then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement near the back gate. A figure was standing just beyond the light, partially obscured by the shadows. They were wearing a dark hoodie, and their face was impossible to make out. My hands trembled as I described what I was seeing to Elena. The figure suddenly moved closer, stepping into the light. I gasped as I saw their face, or rather, the lack of it. They were wearing a mask, a featureless white mask that reflected the glow of the porch light. They stood there for a moment, completely still, as if they were waiting for something. Then they raised a hand and waved. I bolted from the kitchen and locked myself in the downstairs bathroom, dialing 911 with shaky fingers. The dispatcher assured me that officers were on their way and told me to stay on the line until they arrived. Bailey barked frantically from the living room, his deep guttural growls echoing through the house. Minutes later, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The police arrived quickly, but by the time they searched the yard, the masked figure was gone. They found footprints in the snow leading from the backyard gate to the porch, and then back into the woods behind the house. One of the officers suggested it might have been a prank or someone trying to scare me, but the deliberate way the figure had stood there and waved made me think otherwise. It felt personal, as if they knew I was there and wanted to frighten me. The police stayed for a while to make sure everything was secure before leaving. I called Elena again, and she insisted I come stay at her place for the night. I didn't argue. After packing up Bailey and my things, I left the house and spent the rest of Christmas Eve sleeping on Elena's couch,